She's an assistant professor. She got her PhD from Drew University. She's taught at CSB and SJU since 2007. Received her bachelor's from James Madison University, a master's in STM from Lutheran Theological Seminary, and doctorate degree from Drew University. I've also heard a lot of wonderful things about her. I haven't personally had her as a professor, but everybody seems to love her. So please give it up for Anna Mercedes.
Hi. Thank you very much for that welcome.
And actually, before you start, we'd like to declare.
Oh, thank you.
So everyone, if you could extend. God, please come down through Anna Mercedes in her word, and let her word really resonate with us today, and just really help us all on our journeys, and hopefully help this talk to resonate with all of us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Let me get behind the mic. When I was in seminary years ago, I also was able to participate in the YTM that was hosted by my seminary for 2 years as a counselor, and then for 2 years as a faculty member, and then 1 year I was a faculty member in this YTM. So it's a pleasure to come and see you. I know it's an exciting time. And like many of you, when I was around 17, I was passionate about theology. This is a passion that started very young for me, certainly by the time of confirmation. So it was very, very good to be in an audience still working on finishing high school. I think it's a great time in your life to do theology. My task today is to talk with you about sin, but I think you will hear a great deal of continuity between what I have to say in my brief time with you and what was said to you yesterday by Dr. Bernie Evans, and what will be said again to you tomorrow by Dr. Dan Finn. They're both my colleagues. And while my special emphasis is on how our ecological living, especially in the United States, often constitutes sin, what they will say about economics and the dignity of all people is directly related. So I hope you experience some connection. When we talk about sin, one of the key things that I'd like you to take home with you from today is the distinction between individual sin and structural or corporate sin. So you're going to go to that whiteboard and write these terms down. Individual sin is the sort of sin that we're often taught about first. The sort of sin that makes you think, what have I done? What do I need to confess? For many of us, our thoughts about sin stop here because we haven't been taught to look further. But the vast amount of damage most of us will do in our lives is not, in fact, individual sin. Rather, you can use one of these three terms for it. Institutionalized sin. Having a little trouble with the spelling there this morning. It is June. What do you think, Jeff? Would this be an A or an I? Not sure. Think it looks okay with the A? All right, let's leave the A. So for those of you who may not be able to see this, what I have written are three terms. Institutionalized sin, structural sin, corporate sin. You can also use the word evil instead of sin if you would like. And most of the time today I'm going to focus on the middle term. They're synonyms. I'm not trying to say that they're different, but I'll use the word structural or the phrase structural sin most often because I want you to leave my little time today thinking about sin as something that is embedded in the structures all around us, rather than something that is primarily coming from your own heart. Our own hearts do, of course, participate in sin, as the video you just watched was making clear. But there's a lot of us and a lot of hearts, and through time, these sins build up into structural mechanisms, and those are the things that hurt our lives and control other lives more profoundly than the little things that many of us will do. Now, there are huge individual sins that people commit. You're familiar with that. But most of the huge sins that are marring the world, hurting people, starving people, etc., are institutionalized. That is, they're built into the structure. If our world was a big building like this one, structural sin would be like the pipes that run through the building. It's all there. And to take that sin out, which we would hope to do through the power of God's grace, would restructure the building entirely. Our whole lives would look different if we could remove that sin from the workings of the global ecosystem and global relationships. So I've learned a lot about structural sin from this book. This is Cynthia Motivita's book, Resisting Structural Evil. And if some of you go home from YT and wanting to read more this summer, I would really recommend this book, Restructuring Structural Evil. It's written to be very accessible, and I think you would find it inspiring. So today I want to read a little bit to you about Cynthia. And Cynthia is a friend of mine, actually. She wants you to know, she wants all the readers of the book to know, that she started her own journey to try to fix structural sin around ecological issues when she was a teenager like you. Actually, she was a little bit younger. I think she was maybe 14 at the time. So let me read this to you. Awareness that all was not well between people like me and many of the world's impoverished people dawned on me through a film. It was shown to a youth group when I was 14 years old. I watched, aghast, as the film depicted the harsh exploitation of sugarcane workers in the Dominican Republic and their ensuing suffering. Lines were sharply portrayed between these workers' nearly insufferable reality and the vast profits made by corporate owners of the sugar industry located in my country. Equally clear and even more troubling to me was the connection between those workers' sufferings and what we North Americans eat. I soon learned to my horror that this was but one instance in the complex webs of exploitation enabling our extravagant acquisition and consumption. Years of activism followed, so from the time she was a teen on well into her career. I believed that if the people of my country simply knew what was on the other end of their material wealth, their consumption patterns would change. But merely knowing, I learned, was not enough to enable radical social change toward justice. The chains that bind us into systematic exploitation of others and of the earth are intricate and cleverly hidden. These chains, however, can be broken and transformed. The world is full of people doing just that. And so in this book, we examine these chains as structural evil, forces that bind our power to live in ways that love neighbor as self and to protect Earth's well-being. So she's saying here that structural evil is like a chain that binds or holds back your ability to love your neighbor, to honor the dignity of human persons, and to look after Earth. That even if you as an individual think that's a really great idea to love the Earth, that structural sin is binding you from doing as much as you could. Not because you need to kind of get clear about the structural sin that you yourself are responsible for, but rather that we as a people need to get clear about the structural sin that binds all of us. So this is less an individual reflection and more a corporate one. Corporate comes from the same root word that means corpus or body. So as a body, we need to get clear about sin. So if I is written under individual sin, we would be written here. And the video you watched was talking about the forgiveness God brings us. God does forgive us as individuals, yes. But God's forgiveness mostly has been one for us as a body, as a people. So there is a power to work against the structural sin in the world. To give you an example of what structural sin would look like, I'd like to read a little vignette that's also in this book. After I do that, I have some pictures to show you that will help the whole thing take on another dimension. I'm hoping as you hear this that it reminds you a little bit about what you heard from Bernie Evans yesterday. So this is a story that's in this book. If you do read this book later this summer, there's lots of stories. This is a story about international hazardous waste. Alma Van Dalen and her 3 children, Justina, Elmer, and Dabby, used to live in a simple 2-room hut near the shore of Mactan Island in the central island region of the Philippines. Alma's husband, Erwin, would head out well before dawn each day on a small wooden outrigger boat to catch fish for his family and to sell in the local market. They were not wealthy, but the sea usually provided food, and Alma was usually able to sell the fish, along with some simple fruits and vegetables grown near their home. And then, it seemed to almost occur overnight, resorts began to crop up left and right. And with the resorts came tourists. The stretch of beach along the east coast of Mactan Island had become prime real estate for tourism, with its clear waters and views out into the ocean, away from the smoggy city. The Van Dalens, their extended family, and all their neighbors were forcibly displaced to make room for a row of shiny new beach houses. The Blue Water Resort, the Hilton, and the Shangri-La. Erwin Van Dalen took a job as a Japanese fare collector in the city. I'm thinking this is like a taxi driver, hanging off the back of the brightly painted open-air buses in the exhaust-filled streets to make sure, I see, he's actually collecting fare, that passengers paid their 7 pesos for each ride. And Alma took the children into the city, but without the ocean to provide fish, or the small plot of land to grow vegetables, or a roof under which to sleep, they became economically desperate. Finally, Alma found a position in a recycling center on the outskirts of the city. Her children canvassed the massive piles of scrap metal during the day, looking for vulnerable parts, or valuable parts. They are the vulnerable ones here, I shall soon see. Alma worked inside, stripping down appliances that someone else far away had used. Her work required burning plastics and dipping materials in vats of acid. Within just weeks, she began to experience skin and respiratory problems. But the children seemed worse off. All day they sifted through deconstructed machines, cords, plugs, wires, chips, metal, and plastic parts, inhaling toxic fumes and exposing themselves to lead, mercury, copper, methylmercury, PCBs, and hundreds of other chemicals, the effects of which can be severe. Exposure to neurological toxins such as lead is poison to the developing brains of infants and children, as many of you already know, even in tiny concentrations. Lead can paralyze the moving neurons within the growing brain of a child, limiting the child's later learning and development. Alma's children and several other children who lived and worked in this metal scrapyard began to display evidence of these neurological disorders: difficulty listening, speaking, memorizing, calculating, understanding. Levels of autism and mental retardation rose in this population, as well as ADD, ADHD, and dyslexia. Asthma was almost universal, and as carcinogens settled into these young bodies, the seeds of later cancers were sown. Keep in mind where this began. It began with tourism coming into the area. The connection between that and this health crisis for young people seems so far, but it was direct. Alma's choice was between destitution and poison. She chose the poison and still ended up with a fair bit of destitution. The recycling center paid its workers less than $1 per day to dismantle toxic scrap waste that came over from America on a ship. Some of the supposedly innocuous materials that arrived in shipping containers were in fact hazardous waste, often mislabeled as scrap metal or material for recycling. Officials at the nearby port in Mactan were too busy to inspect all the containers, or sometimes accepted bribes to turn a blind eye to the hazardous materials entering the country. Often, they were simply deceived by the false labeling. So as you hear this story, which is a story that has affected way more families than just that one, you can ask yourself, have I done anything individually that's hurt this family? Well, it seems unlikely. You're way here, way over here, and they're way over there. It's a very distant thing. However, is it possible that a computer or something you have put into a recycling has because of webs of structural sin that offload American waste to impoverished countries, has ended up affecting the health of one of those children? Absolutely. And so there's a web of structural sin that you are not free from and I am not free from that is binding us to them. And to help make that clear, Mo Levita wrote a second story, and this one is sort of a hypothetical one, to help you imagine how a couple of college students in the U.S. might be connected to that family. As I read it, I'm aware that not all of you would associate with the same social class that these college students that you're about to hear about are part of. On the other hand, many of you do, or are part of this social class. You do associate with it, or you are part of it. But in America, there's lots of different cultures and lots of different amounts of money that people live with. Even if we set that aside, the chances that all of us, even if we have different amounts of money at home, have vastly more access to the sorts of electronic things that can be poisoning these children, the chances are really high. So even someone who doesn't have a lot of money in the States has more access to the kinds of things that these folks are later dismantling than they ever will, even if we're simply talking about an electronic toothbrush. So as you listen to this story, try to think, where do you plug in with this group of college guys? Jason and his college housemates inherited a blender from the apartment's previous residents, but it had been acting up recently. On top of that, the scroll feature on Jason's iPod stopped working. The blender, which was 4 years old and no longer covered by warranty, emitted a vaguely smoky smell, and the motor was weak. The iPod issue seemed isolated to one small area, but it was frustrating since the device was only a year old. Annoyed and eager to fix both, Jason began looking into repair options. He searched online for electronics repair shops, but they were either too expensive or unable to fix the problem. His roommates all gave him the same advice: just buy a new one. They're getting cheaper, and you can upgrade while you're at it. Jason's mom agreed that he should just buy a new blender and iPod. An iPod or an iPad? I think this is an iPod we're talking about here. She was in the process of remodeling her own kitchen and was looking forward to upgrading all the appliances and installing a flat-screen TV on the kitchen wall. "Don't we already have 2 TVs in the house?" Jason asked his mother. "Well, yes," she replied, "but this is so I can watch Martha cooking dinner." Jason didn't push the issue, although he wondered what would happen to the old kitchen appliances that were probably still perfectly useful. And that got him wondering just how many appliances now occupied his childhood home. Stereo systems, electric toothbrushes, power tools, video game consoles, lamps, refrigerators, chargers for mobile devices, printers, air conditioners, a laundry machine, and so on. His parents even had a charcoal broiler in the backyard that plugged into an outdoor outlet. Jason followed the advice of his friends and his mom, and soon life was back to normal with some shiny new electronics. He threw the blender into the trash and added the iPod to the recycling, hoping that it would count as scrap metal. So as you can see, the life of Jason is connected to the life of the family you heard about at first, but in ways that Jason could easily never be aware of. She goes on to hypothesize in this book that folks like Jason can become aware of these connections and can live differently in an attempt to participate in God's healing power in the world that can transform some of these exploitive actions. But if you imagine the difference between Jason's health going forward and the health of those children you heard about earlier, you can see that those children are suffering far more, and it's not because of any individual sins of them. And those kids have not done something bad, and now they're suffering for it. That's not at all what's going on. So Mo Levita asks, what can it mean for people who are what she calls over-consumers? If she walked in here, she would suggest to all of us that we are over-consumers, even not knowing us, not knowing a thing about anybody in the room except for me and someone else knows it. She would just say, based on where we live and the amount of electricity we've got here today and the kind of life we'll live just today on campus, that we're over-consumers. She wants to know, what can it mean for us to claim a moral life? To say that we have been forgiven of sin, that we are hoping to be moral. She would say, if she were here, we have been forgiven of our sin. And the road to morality is one on which we will need God's help, because this is a big road about transforming structural sins, not just cleaning out your own heart and the things you may be aware of. So here's what she says. She says we're dangerous. She says we're killers. killer. It's kind of strong. She says it this way. Assumed powerlessness in the face of systemic evil, or you could also say systematic or institutionalized evil, is a fundamental problem of contemporary United States society. It's a society rich with compassionate and well-intentioned people, and I would bet most of you coming to ITM are that, compassionate and well-intentioned, who nevertheless live in ways that spell death for many of Earth's most impoverished human beings and for the planetary web of life. I write for these dangerous people, she says, and as one of them. And I would say, speaking to you today, I am one of these dangerous people as well. So my life driving over here today has already used so much oil that it's had an effect on the planet and has triggered some suffering through institutionalized sin. I'm just trying to get to you to talk to you about this. What does it mean for us, she asks, killers, to claim moral lives? Morality and Christian ethics in the context of systemic evil that parades as good is the focus of her study, and I would suggest it's also the focus of much of your time together as you look at the ecological crisis. So the ecological crisis is not really just a question of how often you recycle your plastic bottles. It's a question of how much all of us, and how much Christians in the U.S. are bound up in structural or institutionalized sin, which is causing suffering beyond what we can comprehend. The New York Times this year, really this decade, has been writing a lot of articles that could help you see the effects of structural sin, and so I have some pictures to show you from the New York Times. Now, to show them to you, I have to move to the computer, so you'll have to listen to me from the back first. Okay, so this is a series of articles that I would encourage you to look up on your own later, because I would wager that many of you have some electronic devices that can let you do that. So if you're taking notes, even just in your head, think to yourself, March 28th, 2014, an article called Borrowed Time on Disappearing Land. Because I'm not actually going to be reading the article to you, I'm just showing you the pictures. So if this is interesting, read it yourself later. It's not a long article. And you can simply Google it, and you'll come to the New York Times site, and here you go. So this is telling you that in Bangladesh, particularly, climate change is affecting the people there much more than it's affecting people in other parts of the world. And the overall thesis of all these pictures I'm going to be showing you is this, that the poorer a person is, the more they are likely to be affected by global climate change. This is a product, I would say as a theologian, of institutionalized sin. Because persons who are not, in fact, driving up global warming are the people whose lives will suffer for it. So the ways that I myself this week am driving up global warming, through the chains of structural sin, that's hurting people that I'll never meet personally. So this little illustration helps you to remember that. The higher the poverty, the more the effect of the waterline as global warming changes coastlines around the world. And that little cartoon is also on the New York Times. So here we go. This is helping you to see that in this region, people are disproportionately affected by global climate change, even though, as the caption says underneath it, the people of this country have contributed little to the emissions that are driving up the global climate change. If you go to this site later, you can watch videos like this one. You don't actually need to hear it to be able to see what it's saying. The captions are going to start here in just a second. So this young woman is telling you that the land that her family lived on is gone now, and they've been displaced and forced to live here instead. And you can read about that if you read the article later. This woman is standing where her house used to be. This is showing you images that relate to the stories I just read you from Cynthia Molabita's book. A lot of people have been forced off coastland life, and they now have to seek work in cities. So this is an example of some of the work in cities in a brick-making factory that people have been forced to take. This is very brief and worth watching. This is showing you how much land is likely to disappear due to global warming. So these are people's homes that are disappearing. And the people's homes that are disappearing here are not the homes of people who are driving up carbon emissions. Watch as that city just totally goes underwater. So 18 million people who are not having a huge carbon footprint in the next 40 years. That's an effect of structural sin. This story here that goes under the heading, Losing Everything, I won't read it to you for the sake of time, but it is so similar to the one I just read you from the book. So I would truly encourage you to Google this article later. It's telling you that there was a storm that came through, the grandparents of the family die, the father of the family takes ill, they all move to the city to try to get work. If you look here into this paragraph that I'm highlighting, you would see that the mother of the family, who then loses her husband dies, she commits 3 of her children to work in a brick factory. She later ends up selling 2 of her children to the brick factory out of desperation, trying to find a way to survive. So these are people younger than you who are being sold into servitude in factories as a result of having lost their coastland homes. This video here, which again you won't be able to hear, is showing the life of this young boy. He's younger than you are, and he works at this brick making factory. When asked about his mother, who he never sees anymore, he says that he does miss her, but she's far away. And this video just details for you the work of his day. Again, I encourage you to go watch it later. And then in another article called Rising Seas, which you see here, you can see all sorts of videos and films, pictures I should say, that show you what's happening around the world. So here is a system of tiny islands that are rich with tuna in the seas around there. This land could be wealthy, but it's not. It's one of the poorest places in the world. This is how people are living. And these are the people who will lose their homes. You see how they've tried to keep them up with sandbags? And it's likely that the entire thing will be, the entire nation will be submerged by the end of the century. This is showing you Greenland and how this glacier here is one of the fastest receding. This family used to have to import vegetables because it was way too cold to grow them where they lived. Now they grow their own. This is showing you another nation that's going to totally be displaced. It's off Panama's Caribbean coast. This is one of the tribal leaders. He's looking for land further inland to move his people to. The people are harvesting coral to try to build up their homes and protect them, but this really isn't protecting their homes very much, and it's destroying the coral reef at the same time. The people are very proud of their indigenous ways and are therefore resisting the attempts of the government to move them in where they will be safer because they're wanting to protect their own cultural traditions. And then in a shocking contrast, you can see what global warming is also doing to wealthier places. So here's Florida, and Florida's in one of the most dangerous positions in the U.S. for losing land, but just imagine how different it would be for somebody to lose one of these than for those people who had sandbags to lose their livelihood and their homes. So here's a couple up in Massachusetts that's likely to lose their beach home. But just look at the difference between their lives and the lives you've been seeing.
This is what Molabita means when she talks about overconsumption. The way it would affect this couple to lose their beach house is just totally different than how it would affect a family to lose really their entire culture and their home. This is a seawall in Boston, and more from Florida. This is in Fiji, an Irish family that lived there and has been burying their relatives there for a long time is now finding the cemetery underwater. They've rebuilt a seawall 5 times. Each time it's gone under. That's how much the sea level is rising. People are being moved in. And the whole community is likely to go underwater. So you can see all that if you look up rising seas on the New York Times. And again, the thesis is this, that the more a community is impoverished, the more it is affected by global ecological destruction. And there's a phrase for that. So I'm all done with the screen. I'm going to come back to the front. The phrase for this is called, or the study of it would be called ecological justice, eco-justice. And the problem itself is called environmental racism. Environmental racism is an example of institutionalized sin. Some people also use the phrase environmental colonialism. The point is that the poorer you are, the more likely you are to suffer from ecological devastation. My family will suffer from ecological devastation. We already are. There's no way we can't. You can tell that I'm pregnant. The different plastic foods and things I've been eating out of my whole life have already left little plastic particles inside my body. The only way those could ever get out is if I breastfeed my child. It's my 3rd child. I will breastfeed the child. That child will drink right away. Little plastic particles that have been part of my life. There's no way around that. The only way I can avoid letting it not get out is by not breastfeeding. But of course, breastfeeding far outweighs the dangers of those plastics. Not if I were a woman that lived, for instance, on the coastline of a place like Greenland and had been eating fish all my life. Then the mercury levels in my body would be so high that my breast milk would actually be toxic for my baby. But you see, I'm not living that life. I'm living this very affluent life where I can make sure I don't eat too much mercury and all these other things. So I am less affected by the structural sins which I am producing. I'm helping to cause the problems for that Greenland mother while my baby grows up, hopefully healthy and well. So that's an example of environmental racism. If I want to study it, then I'm studying eco-justice. This is a good thing. This is not a good thing. Environmental racism is not good. Eco-justice is a good thing. So, I'm here just to talk about sin. This is only day 2 of your work together. If it were the last day, I would try to be a bit more uplifting. But I thought it would be kind of me to at least include one uplifting quote. And so know that if you were to buy this book and study it, you would see that her proposal here is that God, as a force of love in the world, is always and every day working to mend the damage done by our institutionalized sins. That as much as many of us are used to singing and thinking about Christ's death meaning forgiveness for us and life in heaven for us, the other part of all that, the other part of what Christ has done in the world, and God is committed to doing, is bringing a sort of resurrection life to all of creation now and today, while we're living. That God's Spirit can't stop trying to heal the world. So the hope is that you might get more and more aware of that every day, tap into it, plug into that. Because we already know we're plugged into the institutionalized sins that are hurting people. But God's Spirit would also be fortified. We're in the season of Pentecost, we just talked about God's Spirit filling up the people of God. So as God's Spirit fills you up too, you can start becoming aware of the ways God's resurrection heals the sins that are yours and mine. And Molabita's way of saying that comes toward the end of her book, Love in Action, Resistance and Rebuilding.
We are not morally powerless in facing the economic and ecological violence that inundates our lives. To the contrary, as eyes that are we's spanning the globe, and as we's attentive to the beckoning of God, whose love will bring abundant life for us all, we are replete with moral power. In other words, you're caught up as sinners in big webs, but you also have enormous moral power. That divine love breathes in us, urging us to delicate intelligence, creativity, energy, political savvy, skill, urging our souls toward a world in which all people and all of creation may flourish. That love beckons us, beckons you to renounce economic and ecological violence and to craft more moral economic policies and practices. And I intentionally end with this quote about economics because tomorrow your special visitor is a theologian and an economist. So he can talk to you about the way global economy is particularly caught up in these webs. So if you remember just two phrases from today, from me talking to you, remember the difference between individual sin and structural sin, or institutionalized sin. And perhaps a little later, look up those articles on the New York Times. I think it would be worth your time. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a very good YTM.